And we are live. Greetings, salutations, and welcome to the World and the World Building Podcast live. And I have with me the amazing Shona Kinsella. Shona, how are you doing?
I am good, thank you. How are you today?
Very, very well. Very excited about today's topic. We're talking about adapting folklore for fantasy fiction and fiction in general, and games and all kinds of world building. And Shona and I have been having a good natter before this about what we're going to be talking about, and basically getting very excited about folklore and how we can use it for our world building and narratives. Before I get overexcited, because we all know that happens, let me introduce Shona properly. Scottish fantasy author and editor Shona Kinsella's books include The Heart of Winter, Petra MacDonald and the Queen of the Fae, the industrial fantasy novella The Flame and the Flood, and in non-fiction, Outlander, yes, that Outlander, and The Real Jacobites, Scotland's Fight for the Stuarts. Her short fiction can be found in various magazines and anthologies, and she's also a freelance editor and all-round writing expert for authors and publishers across the globe. If you go to Shona's website, which is shonakinsella.com, you can find out about all of that and about the work she does for the British Fantasy Society, where she is the chair, and you can find out about her latest book, The Daughters of Nicnevin. Before we get started, because this is highly relevant, Shona, who is Nicnevin and why is she so exciting?
Nicnevin is the Fae Queen of Witches, and she is always getting caught up in trouble all over the place. So she's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And she is a folkloric character, correct? She is drawn from folklore.
Yes, that's right.
So this book, I will read you the blurb because it was also blurbed, by the way, on Mary Robinette Cowell's blog. It was featured over there. It is a fantastic book, Flame Tree Press. Gorgeous books they publish, and they have exquisite taste, if I may say so. They published one of my short stories. I'm biased. But anyway, Myrud and Constance, two powerful witches, meet in the early days of the 1745 Jacobite uprising. While the men of the village are away fighting, the villagers face threats from both the Black Watch and the Raiders, and women are confronted with their vulnerability. They enlist the help of Nicnevin, Fae Queen of the Witches, to bring men made of earth to life to help protect their village. But just who do they need protection from? And what will happen when the village men return? So this book is exactly why we are talking about folklore today. It is the perfect example of how you can use a folkloric element in your stories to basically explore real-world issues, real-world narratives, real-world problems, both in the past and in the present, and in made-up second worlds as well. It's basically what we're going to be talking about. So to launch us off, I think a really good place to start is favorite things. Now, chat, I want your help. Those of you listening from the future on the podcast, use the comments for this. I want to hear about your favorite folklore-inspired games, novels, and movies. This is the good stuff. This is what we're talking about today. This is the realm of our interest today. So, Shona, what are your thoughts? What are your favorites here?
Okay, so that way once I started thinking about this, I just kept thinking about more and more books.
There's so many of them. They're everywhere, right?
There's so many great examples. So first of all, I've got Sister Song and The Song of the Huntress by Lucy Holland. They are both beautiful, beautiful examples of folklore used. And they're just gorgeously written books. Highly recommend them. Then Fathom Folk and Hideborn by Eliza Chan, which uses folklore in really interesting ways. Folklore from all around the world, and it sort of merges it all together into something new, and I love it. There's Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, who is just a fantastic writer. Like, I could read anything if she wrote a short and considered it. Gorse and Ragwort by Sam K. Horton. They're based in Cornwall, and it's sort of Cornish folklore, and they're really really exciting books. And of course, the Green Man series by Juliet E. McKenna. And
we love Juliet. Juliet is a past guest on World Building Con. Great speaker, great writer, all around wonderful human,
She's so lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. Sidra Honnet says, Brunhilde's aria, Janet can sing it. Actually, I mean, Wagner is a great example. I mean, we don't like him as a person, But a great example of folklore-inspired creation. Pendragon, says the chat. Excalibur, we have here. Ars Magica, which is an RPG, has a lot of mythic folklore. Fairies by, beg your pardon, Fairies by Aaron Lee and Brian Frood. Yes, absolutely. There's a huge amount of the Brian Frood catalogue, deeply, deeply inspired by folklore and those kinds of things. I had on my list The Witcher, of course. How could I not? I read a wonderful. Actually, I read this as part of the Brian Aldiss World Building Award panel. It got to the finals. It was very good. It was called When Among Crows, and it's a retelling of Polish folklore set in modern day Chicago, which I thought was really wonderful because it dealt with sort of immigration and folklore both at the same time. Beautiful, beautiful story. Really, really interesting. The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. It's an older one I grew up with. The Black Cauldron by Lloyd Alexander, deeply steeped in Welsh folklore. And one that, we'll get to this later, one that isn't one specific folklore tradition, but T. Kingfisher's Metal and Bone, that was a relatively recent release, is a wonderful kind of folkloric without being, specifically one folklore tradition. I thought that was a wonderful story as well. It's Uprooted is also really cool. Yes, absolutely. It's set in a demonic university, satanic kind of demonic witch training space. Very weird, very cool world building there. Princess Mononoke and the Song of the Sea, another fantastic example. Yes, absolutely. So loads and loads of inspiration there for anyone who's sitting there thinking, I haven't really encountered this. Maybe you have and you didn't recognize it. And if you haven't, well, you have a list now. Off you go. Enjoy. We certainly did. So let's talk about reusing folklore, because I think that basically when we do reuse folklore, one of the big considerations for us is who is already familiar with what we're talking about, and how can we stick with expectations, honor expectations, subvert expectations when you're dealing with some of the sort of mainstream folklore like vampires, fairies, those kinds of things. How can you subvert expectations without disappointing people? How can you rely on what the reader knows while still surprising them? What are your thoughts on this, and how do you handle this one?
So I think the first thing with it is to be really intentional about the choices that you make. So if you're working with something like vampires, for instance, they've got this huge body of work, and people are very familiar with them and think they know the rules, so like stake through the heart and don't have garlic, and they don't go out in daylight, and they certainly don't sparkle. If you're going to make changes like that, then I think you have to be doing it for a good reason, because it is going to poke at something for readers. So if you're going to say your vampires can go out in daylight, which Dracula can go out in daylight, he's just weaker, then that's fine. But I think you need to sort of be clear about what you're trying to achieve with that. Because it is going to be a sort of stumbling block for readers. So I think it's one of those things, you can kind of do what you want with it, but you have to know that why you're doing it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So really kind of be very intentional, make intentional choices. And I guess intentional, that feedback into the tone, that feedback into the mood you're trying to create, or feedback into the theme of what you're trying to create, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And if you want to do something that subverts reader expectations, are you doing it just to try and like pull off a twist? Or does it fit in with the tone, and is there a sort of underlying framework to support it? And then if you can't make it work without really changing what people are expecting, then are you using the right folkloric creature.
Yeah.
Should you perhaps be looking further afield for a different creature, or just making your own, but based on that, take the elements that work for your story and then build something new from it.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. There is always this question in world building is like, when is an elf not an elf? When is a horse not a horse? When are your vampires? You call them schmampires, but they do everything that a vampire does. When are they just a vampire? What is your thought with that regarding folklore?
So I think with folklore, if you're going with creatures that have got sort of familiar attributes the readers are going to expect, then if you're going to call it something different, you have to be adding to it, or changing the story somehow. Because otherwise, just call it the thing that it is, because people know what it is anyway, and they're going to call it that even if you don't.
Absolutely. That does raise an interesting question about how do you know what your readers know? Case in point, I wrote a short story recently that will be published. And for the UK audience, it has in it a creature called a Nukkalavi. Now, this is something from Orkney folk mythos, right? This is a thing that exists in the folk world, and I reused it. But an American reader who beta read it said, "Wow, I love the world building you did with this crazy monster you invented." And I had to be like, "Well, thank you, but I didn't invent this. It exists." How can you tell? How can you guess? How can you make allowances for not knowing what readers know or what players know?
So what I would say is, if it is plot, if the thing that you want them to know is plot specific, like if they have to know it to understand what's happening, you can't assume that they know it. You have to put it on the page. So like, I know what an Nicnevin is because it's a story that I'm familiar with as a Scot. But you can't assume that other people know what it is. So if you're relying on people knowing information about it for the plot to work, then you have to actually explicitly say it, even if you feel like most people should understand. Because unless you're talking about like vampires and werewolves, and the really, really well-known ones, the chances are quite high that a number of your readers are not going to be familiar with it. And I think that increases the more that you get into sort of more local folklore and more area specific things. Like in Scotland, we have stories about specific creatures that live in like one glen, so you can't assume that anyone even outside of that particular part of Scotland is really familiar with that story, which makes it really rich for playing with. So
let's not gloss past the fact that I just absolutely butchered the pronunciation of that creature I just said. And could you give us the proper pronunciation of it, Shona?
It's Nicnevin.
Nicnevin. Okay, so now I will try to be slightly less rubbish when I talk about it. And thank you so much for the correct pronunciation. I really appreciate it. Shona is actually Scottish, unlike me. I just have a Scottish name. It's all lies. Just to be clear, and just in case you're wondering where this absolutely beautiful accent is coming from. So, yeah, I think that takes us nicely to this question. Who owns folklore? I'm sorry, guys, we have to talk about this. It's a really big question. So, obviously, lots of people in the chat were shouting out, there's this thing from Japanese legend, and there's this thing from Indian legend, and that's fantastic. But can we use them? Should we use them? Is that okay? How can we approach this? What are your thoughts?
So I tend to think no one owns folklore. It's stories that have been added to and built upon and shaped by tens of people, hundreds of people, thousands, over sometimes centuries or longer. No one can stake a claim on that and say that bit's mine, unless you've done something really, really different with it. I think though that where you are taking folklore from a culture that's not your own, I think you need to practice the same sort of discretion and courtesy that I would say that you have to practice if you're taking from religions not your own, or political structures that are not, that if you're taking something that isn't yours, then is there something of yours that you can use instead that does the same job? If there's not, um, what is it that you're trying to do with it? Are you being respectful of it? Are you treating it like it's a toy? Or, there's in the chat what happens when people turn folklore into religion. So a lot of folklore is roundabout old religion. So, like in Scotland, we have a lot of the folklore's tied in with deities and spirits of place and things which were part of the religion here. And there are still people who practice that as a living faith. So, like, don't mock their gods, like just treat things with sensitivity, I think, is the main thing. And ask yourself if you are the right person to tell the story. If you are telling a story that's entirely based in a culture different from yours, on stories that are from a different living people, then why are you the one to talk about it? And maybe you are. That's not to say that you shouldn't do it. It's just that you need to do it with thought and care.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I wanted to flag is, if you're talking about, paganism, if you're talking about witches, that's still a religion today. So be very, very respectful of, how you're talking about this when you speak to people who have, lived experiences about this. Be very respectful. You're talking about their religion. This is something that we need to remember, because a lot of people come to some folklore like it's history. It's something from the past. It doesn't exist anymore, but folklore is living, it's alive, and it's constantly evolving. A lot of what we think of now as, ye olde folklore is from the Victorian era. It's not really, it's not old at all. And so, being aware of this, these are still current and living stories that have great meaning to people. I think it's something, it's easy to not know that if you are not part of that culture or, within that space.
We certainly had with my my last novel, The Heart of Winter. It's a reimagining of a Scottish myth about the gods and the seasons and things like that. And many reviewers called it a retelling of the Hades and Persephone myth. So they totally took my gods out of it and said, oh, it's obviously this Greek thing because we've all heard of the Greek thing. And the sort of Persephone's involvement with the cycle of the seasons, but this was a real Scottish myth with deities that are worshipped in Scotland today. So yeah, I think it's that, be aware of taking these things like they're still alive. They're still important parts of people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a really good point, when you're interpreting other people's folklore, is to be aware that you're not necessarily getting a whole story. The people who interpreted your book, when they reviewed it, got it wrong. They were like, oh, it's inspired by this. And it was not at all inspired by that. It was something completely different, but their associations colored their interpretation of what you'd written. So yeah, I think that's something, be aware of your lens, basically. Like, know when you're looking at things that you know what you know, and there's a whole world outside your own personal experience, and that is enriching and exciting. And ask lots of questions, respectfully, I guess. What about the line between inspiration and plagiarism? What do you think about that with regards to kind of folklore and the ownership of folklore?
So I think that with things like folklore, because there's so many variations in even just, one story or one myth, there's all these different versions that have been told over all the different from one time to another or from one decade to another. We all have our own lens. And that's, we are looking at these stories that are much older, we're looking at them through a modern lens, so we maybe see things in them that are very different to what the original, if there's even an original, how far back do you go, but we're seeing the stories in a different light than people who have looked at them previously have. So I don't think it's possible to plagiarize folklore.
Yeah.
Because I think it's not a finished thing. It's a living thing that changes and grows with us all the time. However, if you take an actual written version of it and just copy that, then obviously that's not okay. You should be maybe in conversation with what's gone before. You should be bringing your own understanding to it and making it something that is uniquely yours.
Yeah, I love that. I think a lot of the leeway that we have here, this kind of touches on the craft conversation, but a lot of the leeway we have here is the way that we characterize and personalize these stories. Because one of the things that is very common about folklore is folklore deals with icons, and folklore deals with avatars, and folklore deals with sort of tropes, in essentially. So you get the maiden, and you get the witch, and you get these sort of archetypes, and wherever you can sort of personalize, wherever you can draw it down to that sort of personal enrichment, that personal POV, whether it's a game or a book or whatever, that's a great way to kind of make it more personal to you, and interpret it in a way that kind of takes it down from archetypes into something that is more of your own interpretation, more of your own experience through that, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The more of yourself that's in it, the less of other people's work is in it, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the more you can be sort of specific as opposed to general, and that really has got us into that question, honestly. How can you capture that folkloric feeling through craft? So I mentioned earlier T. Kingfisher, her book Nettle and Bone, which is a recent release, is a book that feels folkloric. It's not necessarily folklore, but she made a lot of choices that makes it feel folkloric. I'm sure we can all think of stories we've read, games we've played that feel folkloric, even though we can't put our finger on why. So how can you capture that feeling through craft, through the words we put on the page, through the shapes of the stories and the world building that we craft?
So I think there's some different levels to this. So part of it's what you were saying about the archetypes, like folklore is using archetypes. So folklore's telling specific types of story, right? They're often warning us off of something. So, like the stories about people who go into a fairy ring and disappear for 300 years. It's telling you not to mess with the fae, right?
Not touchy.
So many of these folklore stories, they're warnings about specific things. They're warnings not to go traveling at night on your own, right? Because when it's dark and cold, I think you might not make it home. And even today in the Highlands, if you want to go traipsing about in the dark at night, you might not make it home.
Yeah.
So I think if you want to write something that has a folkloric feeling, it probably needs to have some sort of underlying kind of message, like folklore stories have a message. And think about what is the warning, or what's the sort of the key lesson that your reader should be taking away from it. So I think on that sort of higher level, and then obviously archetypes like the witch, the maiden, the stepmother, those are all sort of frequent features in folkloric stories. So think about, why is that? What function do they serve in the folklore? And then how does that serve a function in your story? And then there's the language itself. So I think if you've ever had the absolute joy of listening to Anna Smith Spark read aloud from her work, Anna's work has a very sort of mythic and folkloric feel about it, even if you can't necessarily point at it and say, well, that's based on this thing. And I think that a lot of that is to do with the sort of rhythm of how she writes. She definitely writes with the intention of reading aloud. So she feels the rhythm as she writes, and sort of that informs her. So she has talked about her writing process has been really important to her to imagine reading the words out loud and to get that same feeling on the page. So I think a lot of folklore, again, we're going back to sort of pre-literate societies, or certainly pre-widely literate societies. So we're talking about oral storytelling.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot in the sort of rhythm and presentation of the actual language, that if you can give that feeling of this story would be told aloud, this story would be recited at a campfire, then that helps to give that sort of folkloric vibe, even if you're not specifically relying on certain stories or creatures or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about something like the myths of ancient Greece, which are interesting, they straddle the line between that which is entertainment and that which is religion, because the way that gods worked in ancient Greece is very complicated and not exactly, it's quite liminal, like it's quite non sort of, it's not one thing and it's not the other according to where our boxes are. But ancient Greek, when it was spoken aloud, was almost sung. It was a tonal language. So you can imagine someone sitting, in a hall somewhere, telling a story in this sort of rhetorical way, and it's almost sung. If you hear great Welsh speakers, sometimes when they speak, it's almost sung. You can imagine the Mabinogion being sort of spoken, sung as it was, recited again and again and again as it was passed from, across many lips from many travelers. These are the origins of so much of our folklore. It's not necessarily the way you meet it on the street today, but it's often where it comes from. And they were performances in many ways. So I love that you've talked about, the language, the sung nature of it, the spoken nature of it, because I think that is something that is often lost when a game master is reading it aloud for the first time and maybe not quite getting it right. When you hear, you read a book silently in your own head and you don't get to read it aloud, you don't get to hear those words in the air. But it is something that it gives it that je ne sais quoi. It gives that sort of intangible folkloric feel to have that sort of almost poetry in the language. I think that another thing that is interesting about folklore, in addition to things like the sort of the avatars, the archetypes that you talked about, is the idea of some of the tropes. Things like there's a test, you have to pass the test. Whether that's doing something or not doing something, whether that's you were rude to a stranger and that was the test. And there are these kind of plot archetypes, these sort of plot tropes, essentially, that you see repeated through folklore, not just in one tradition of folklore, but in many traditions of folklore. Can you think of some others, apart from like the test, that can help us, make our plots feel a little more folkloric?
So things like hidden or mistaken identities are a really common one.
Absolutely.
I just came across a story recently, a Scottish story about a Taravishka, which is a water bill. And there's the stories about this young girl who raises a Taravishka calf without realising that that's what it is. She just thinks it's a cow. and she raises this calf and she lives in a wee croft on the edge of a loch. And then one day a kelpie comes out of the loch and it tries to take the girl, because kelpies are not friendly. They don't.
Not touchy.
So the kelpie tries to take the girl and the Taravishka calf defends her. So it fights off the kelpie, loses its own life, but it scares off the kelpie and the kelpie leaves the loch never to return. So there's that sort of like benefiting or suffering because of the way that you act towards someone that you don't know, or if you don't know their power. So that sort of hidden or mistaken identity is quite a common theme in folklore, certainly in Scottish folklore. What else is there?
There's
Missing
certainly
time.
Yes, missing time is a big one. Very good.
Or time moving at different rates. So you think that you've done something for one night, but actually you've been gone for 300 years. So, that sort of time slipping in places is another sort of common theme, and a fun one to play with in your writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially when you're dealing with Fae, there's a lot about rules and the letter of the law and how that works, and loopholes and those kinds of things, which are often exploited. It's the typical no man of woman born can kill the witch king of Angmar kind of thing. It's like those kinds of rules and loopholes.
Yeah, and like the Aes Sedai, they have to tell the truth, or they can't say something that's not true, but that doesn't mean they can't mislead you with the truth. So that's a common thing with Fae. And then things like the rules of hospitality are really important in folklore. Again, I speak mostly about Scottish folklore because that's where my particular knowledge is. But things like as soon as you have eaten or drunk something that you've been gifted, then that person's not supposed to be able to harm you because they're a host and you're a guest. So that sort of hospitality and guest right stuff is quite prominent in folklore.
That's common across many folklore traditions, interestingly. It's relatively common in Arabic folklore. It's somewhat common in Greek folklore as well, particularly more modern Greek folklore. There's a lot of food stuff as well. I'm thinking of Persephone and the pomegranate. I'm thinking of leaving out offerings for the Fae of I was going to say bread and milk, but I think that's how you give a hedgehog indigestion. But you know what I mean? Like that kind of space.
Yeah, like milk and honey is quite a popular offering for Fae. And then the rule that you should never consume food or drink given to you by the Fae, because then you belong to them.
Yeah. That's reverse hospitality, that is. But I think there is that also, speaking of reverse hospitality, because that is kind of what it is, there is that kind of like left is right and up is down feeling often with folklore, where, not all is as it seems. I'm thinking of kind of like the goblin market trope, the, things that are bizarre. Like sometimes they're wondrous and sometimes they're terrifying, but they are very not human and very nonsensical at first glance. That is a very folkloric thing as well. So I think that these are all really, really good things that you can play with, shapes of story, ideas, tropes that you can kind of draw into your fiction if you're looking to play with this, without necessarily drawing on one specific tradition, but playing in the water, as it were. Someone has commented, Goblin Market like Hellboy. Yes, there is a long tradition of Goblin Markets. Christina Rossetti wrote a poem about Goblin Markets, I believe. But there is a very long tradition of the idea of the Goblin Market. It's very, very cool, very fun to play with. And now I'm not certain it was Christina Rossetti, by the way, but there is a poem about the Goblin Market, and it's the oldest one that I know. So this is just me getting overexcited, basically, again. All right, let's talk about the isms, because this is a thing that we do need to deal with when we are dealing with the baggage of history. So a lot of folklore comes from another time, even if it's a more updated version, often it has its roots in another time. And sometimes that is a more racist time, sometimes that is a more sexist time, sometimes that is a more colonialist time. But we are dealing with the baggage of another age often, and we don't always want to carry those things into our own fiction. So how can we navigate this?
So I think it's back to that sort of being intentional and interrogating the stories. So there's lots of things that you might not necessarily be aware of, especially if you're not part of the group that's being poked at with this like the thing about goblins, and Jewish people, for instance. Like that was not something I was aware of until very recently. So I think there's lots of things like that that you might not actually be aware of, where something folkloric or a sort of stereotypical presentation in the past has had racist or bigoted or prejudiced undertones. So I think it's important to sort of do some research round about that before you decide how to proceed with your own interpretation of it. And it's back to that, just again, thinking about these things and being really intentional about it. Don't just assume that your understanding of it is the only understanding.
Yeah.
And even things like, a particular creature in one person's country might be quite innocent, but the same creature in another country can be like a negative. So that if you're then associate a person with that creature, then like you could be accidentally given the wrong impression. So I think that's the place to start.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Case in point, I have a friend who runs the Erin Chronicles, if you guys have seen that, which is an RPG company. They did a really big Kickstarter recently, called The Ballad of the Witch, and he's in my writing group, so I get to sit with him as he looks at Balkan folklore and tries to make it less problematic, because some of this folklore, they want to carry it into the RPG. The RPG is all about this. They want to create these iconic characters from folklore. But there's one story about a giant whose wife lives in his pocket. And one day, a hero climbs into the giant's pocket and makes nice with the wife, shall we say. This is a PG stream. And then the giant is like, "Oh, I will kill my wife." Excuse me? And then he makes friends with a hero, and they end up being buddies. And this is the story, and it's super problematic. And he was like, "I need to fix this. Ideas, please. We cannot have this in our RPG. It's a massive problem." Not only is it completely surreal, it's also like completely problematic. And these are the kinds of things where, to your point, Shona, you have to be intentional about it. You have to, yes, somebody in the chat is like, "What? Yes, this is a story from Balkan folklore. Some of them are great. Some of them need a little rewriting for a modern audience." And these are the moments where it's important to be intentional. These are the moments where it's important to look at things with critical eyes and ask yourself, how am I going to repurpose this? Am I going to reimagine it? Am I just going to leave this bit out, or we're not going to deal with it? Like, how? And there are options. What are some of the options that you think are available, Shona, with these kinds of problems where you're like, how can I approach this?
So I think in some instances it might be just don't use that. Like just don't.
Not touchy. Thanks a lot, but not touchy.
Sometimes there's just not really a way to modernize it and to make it good. Sometimes what you can do though is just look at what is the problematic thing and what was it trying to achieve, and what could you do differently that still achieves that. So for going back to the Heart of Winter, like I said, it is a reimagining of a Scottish myth about the gods and the seasons. In the original myth, Bride, or Bridget, who is the Scottish goddess of spring, she was kidnapped by the Kayak, who is the goddess of winter, because the Kayak was jealous of Bridget's youth and beauty. And so she's kidnapped and held prisoner in her cave all winter, and spring can't come until Bride is out of the cave.
Yeah.
And Angus, the god of summer, he dreams about Bride, falls in love with her instantly from a dream, so he runs off and rescues her. He borrows 3 days from August and puts the Kayak to sleep, rescues Bride. They flee across the land, bringing spring in their wake. Right, so I thought, why are the two women set in opposition to each other? Why are women always in opposition to each other, right? Because it's sexist. Because we can't be friends. We can't have nourishing relationships. We have to compete. And of course, this crone goddess would be jealous of another woman's youth and beauty, because why would she be happy being a crone? Right. So I redid that by making Bride and the Kayak friends. Not initially, but they become friends. And they'd fallen in love with someone because you saw them for 5 minutes in a dream. That's not really how these things work. So that's all sort of addressed in the book. So I think there's ways that you can look at what the point of that story is, that Bride is trapped in the cave and that Spring can't come until she leaves. So you can achieve that without putting Bride in the kayak at odds. Yeah. So, in my version, she's trapped in the cave for different reasons.
Interesting. Very cool.
So I think that you can sort of break it down like that. What's the story trying to achieve? This bit that doesn't work for me or doesn't work for a modern audience. What's the purpose of it? How else can I serve that purpose? Yeah. And then sometimes, like with the giant's wife in his pocket, maybe there's not another way to say. Maybe it's just some stories have to be let go, and that's okay, because we move on and we don't have to take everything with us all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. We can, sometimes there are things where we say, we can retire that. We accept that it happened. It was a thing. We don't need to keep using it. I love that. Dreams, by the way, another great trope of folklore. All the time. Everybody's dreaming about everybody. Everybody's having prophetic visions, oracles, things coming to pass, things not coming to pass, omens. All great tropes that you can use in your folklore as well. Sorry, it occurred to me as you were telling this beautiful story. I was like, all of these things are great folklore examples as well. So let's talk more about that. Actually, let's talk about this one. Where can you start your folklore research? Where can you go to find things you're more interested about, or even where can you look for sort of overlooked pockets of folklore?
So this is something that for me, I've not done a huge amount of very specific research, because I've been reading folklore like since I was a kid. I think Scotland has a really strong tradition of folklore. It's kind of all over, like you just fall over it as you're walking down the street. So I think that if you're trying to use folklore from a specific place, then being in that place can be really useful way to start, because it can be just right there, all around, like Nessie. It is everywhere. I think there's lots and lots of collections of folklore in books. There's so many compendiums. I don't think that there are that I would specifically say look for particular volumes or folklorists, because I think you often find the more interesting stuff is more away from the kind of mainstream. University websites often have things like that. If they teach a history or folklore courses, they'll have things that you can access for free. It's the National Library of Scotland, the British Library, they have a lot of stuff digitised now as well. Go to wee small museums in the middle of nowhere. Like, there's so many things that you can find if you just get your boots on the ground and, like walk in a place. Especially that really local stuff. Yeah. Like, I go up and down to Fort William in Scotland. It's a place that I'm quite fond of. And I found recently a story about a bridge that's on the way up, about how this bridge was never officially completed because a witch prophesied that if a bridge was ever built there, then the Glen would flood and it would wipe everything away. So when they built the bridge, they deliberately built space for an extra bolt and then left it out, so the bridge was never completed.
You see, laws with cunning loopholes.
Exactly.
We talked about this.
and then because I found this story about the bridge, like literally because I drove over the bridge recently, I found this story about the bridge, and then I found some more stuff about that witch, and then I found a whole story about that witch that may well be the basis of a future novel. So,
Ooh, love it.
I think if you can get into the space, that's really useful. Obviously, if you're writing stories from a place that's far away from you, that's not always practical. But if that's the case, look for wee tiny museums and libraries and things in that area. And the people who manage these organizations, they do it out of passion. A lot of them are volunteers, and they do it because they love the subject. So if you email them and say, I want to write about this area, can you tell me any sort of local versions of it, or what does this mean to you? Do you have anything in your collection about it? So many of them will be happy to help you and to discuss it with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely second museums. Just go to loads of museums. Just go to museums because they're great. Just I'm kind of obsessed with museums. Sorry. A great point from the chat, which echoes what you were saying as well, Shona, which is local. Go as local as you can. Look in your local town or village. It's amazing what is lying there under your feet. What is, read the things underneath statues. Go and learn a little bit more about where you are, because they say write what you know, which is a bit of a difficult statement, but certainly you can get a lot that's right there under your nose that maybe you haven't paid attention to. So yeah, give your own area a second look as well, and you'll be amazed what you'll find there. I think, all really, really good points there. I think I will always say Wikipedia is a great place to start. And I will always say go to the bottom of the article and look at the references that have been added to the article, because that is where you will find the gold. In general, for me, and this is a personal thing, the inspirations often come from the little details, like your story about the bridge with the missing bolt that was never, like, that is inspiring. It's, a witch prophesied it would never be finished, and then this. It's such a small story, but it's such a big story. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's so much in that. And, names and dates are all very good and everything else, but for me, those are the little tiny details, the little tiny corners that always get my brain wheels going. And that's the kind of thing that you find less in sort of general, let me tell you about the Greek gods, and there's a paragraph on each. And in the more detailed work, that's where you find those gems. So that's what I would recommend from my own experience.
And things like place names as well. So again, especially in the Highlands in Scotland, so in the Gaelic, it's less so in the English. But in the Gaelic, there's place names that are things like Witch's Boots. Right? Like, why is a hill called Witch's Boots? Because there's got to be a story there, right? So I think looking at things like place names and the shape of the landscape. The kayak that I was speaking about before, there's stories about her form in Scotland by striding over the land, dropping boulders from her apron, and the lochs are like her footprints.
That's
and
amazing.
So I think if you look at the landscape, the shape of it, and things like names, especially the old local sort of colloquial names for things, there's a lot of richness to be found in there.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a very fascinating etiological story about the way that Japan was created and why the islands are shaped as they are, which is too rude for live stream, so I can't tell it. But do go and look it up. It's amazing. And you have been warned. It's not a PG story. But that, like, deeply inspiring and fascinating origin story. But again, too rude for TV, so I can't tell you that. Okay, I think we need to talk about this. Common mistakes when creators reuse folklore, get inspired by folklore, when they want to recreate folklore. What should we be aware of from your own experience or from things that you've sort of seen in the wild?
So I think this goes back to the being intentional thing, right? So I think the most common mistake is using something without thinking about it. which is probably the most common mistake people use and make in any aspect of their writing, is using something without giving it any thought. Like, I don't know how many books I've edited where it's set in a secondary world fantasy and then they have a day called Saturday.
Yeah.
It's like, why would
Do
it be
you have a
called?
Saturn?
So I think it's always about doing things with thought. Another one with folklore, a sort of common mistake, I think, is only looking at the surface of the story and only using the surface of it, and then you're not actually like capturing the meaning and the sort of the fullness that you could get from it. And don't make your vampire sparkly. No, I think if you're going to, like we were saying earlier, if you're going to change sort of popular conceptions, be careful and intentional about it, because there are ones that will just get stuck in people's craw.
Yeah, exactly. And there are things that don't land for whatever reason. I now have an idea for a short story, a parody short story that is basically the Cruella de Vil of sparkly vampires. Like, she wants to make a robe from them, so she's hunting them down. So it's like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, but it's Cruella de Vil Vampire Hunter. I'm not going to write this. Somebody write this. I need this to exist.
I think you should write that.
I have too many other things that I'm not writing right now. The list is too long. I really love what you said about intentionality, and I think that is so important in all of these things. I think another thing is that really examine the themes and remember that the themes that you read are not the themes that were necessarily in that story at the time. Like, to your point, why did they pit two women against each other? Well, there are reasons we're not going to go into, but because we're not here to deconstruct the feminine past. But it is really, really nice that you went, okay, I'm going to take that story and I'm going to use different themes. I'm going to tell a slightly different version of this story. And I think we made a whole YouTube video about this, but one of the things that really makes the difference between a story that's meh and a story that's great is this integration of theme, this understanding of theme and message. And I think being aware that your themes are not necessarily the themes that came as baggage for the story, and that is okay, but you may have to be very intentional about reworking it. And you may want to cut away themes that are problematic and add other themes. You're talking about Persephone and Hades. Lots of problematic things about that story. You might want to include them, you might not, but you need to make choices. You can't just do your thing without making choices. Oh, you can, but it probably won't be as successful.
And I guess I would say when you're doing that, maybe sort of be prepared for some people not to get it, not to understand what you're doing, or to not agree with the way that you've handled it. Things like when you take out the sexism, you get quite a lot of, well, I don't think these people would be so forward thinking in that day. Of course, all women wanted to do was get married and make babies. They conveniently forget about women like Boudica, for instance. There's so I think it's just to understand that if you're doing these things, do them, but some people will be critical of that, and that's fine. They get to be critical and you get to ignore them and do your thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a great question from Twilight Guardian, who asks, how do you find reliable sources for learning about folklore and not mysticism that seems made up? Fairies in particular seem hard to find books that aren't watered down or rainbowified. What are your thoughts on this one, Shona?
So I think with that type of thing, quite often the further back you go, the better. Right, so a lot of the friendly rainbow fairies, that's quite a modern interpretation of them. So if you go back to Victorian or pre-Victorian sources, then you're much more likely to get the fae that are utterly inhuman, and they might help you or they might kill you. And to them, both options might be moral as far as they're concerned, because they're not human. So I think, if you want to look for the sort of more reliable, or not even necessarily reliable, but less watered down, then I would go further back in
Yeah.
the stories. You know,
Yeah.
it's the same way like the Brothers Grimm stories are all much darker than the Disney versions.
Yeah.
So, you know, look at what was being told to adults for adults and not like films that are made for children
Yeah,
and books that are made for
absolutely.
children. And
I will add a little sort of rider to that one, which is beware that a lot of folklore is quite horrific. And another choice that you will need to make is, do I want to do a cozy retelling? Do I want to do a horror retelling? Like what vibe am I going for? What am I trying to get out of this? What experience am I trying to create for my reader or my player? Because that will affect also what choices you're making, what source material you're drawing on. Like the giant with a wife in his pocket, that's not a cozy children's tale. That's not something that's sweet and lovely. That's something that's horrific. There are a lot of stories like that. To your point, a lot of the historical fairy stuff, you know, the Brothers Grimm, these are not cozy, sweet stories. And if you want to retell them as that, that is totally fine. But it's a conscious choice. It goes back to what you were saying about, you know, being aware of the choices you're making. Well, let's have a look. Disney's Cinderella was taken from the French version, which was written down before the German version. Yes, but also it's a bit more complicated than that, as far as I have understood. But yeah, it's a lot, basically. What are your sort of final thoughts for our audience about drawing on folklore, adapting folklore for use in your own world building, for use in your own storytelling?
if you want to do it, absolutely do it. Like there's so much, and there's just this whole wealth of stories, and you know they span human history, and they touch on so many things that are still really important to people today. So absolutely use it in your work. Just do it intentionally. And you know, if it's not from your culture, then consider whether there is a story from your culture that will work just as well.
Yeah, I love that. I would add that these are stories that have stood the test of time. There is something in them that resonates. And I think if you can capture that in your own storytelling, maybe retell it in your own voice, maybe retell it in your own way, you are onto something incredibly powerful that speaks volumes, not just about your own world building, but about the experience of being a person. And I think that that's very magical indeed. Okay, Shona, thank you ever so much for being here. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
It's just been wonderful, and I really have had a blast chatting with you, folks. I hope that you have also enjoyed the wonderful Shona and her great insights into this topic. You can, of course, go to her website for more Shona if you would like, shonakinsella.com. You can find her book, The Daughters of Nicnevin. It is fresh out and all about witches and all about witches and silly queens and folklore in action. So yeah, looking ahead in the calendar, next week Andy is talking about reading month. What are we reading on World Anvil? And the week after that, I am live with folks from Co-op Press talking about Night Hunters. This is a Kickstarter which is coming out all about horror at the RPG table, using horror tropes to tell compelling stories. And yeah, I think I'll be able to reveal something by then as well, which I'm quite excited about. We should be having the incredible Wolfgang Bauer and Celeste Konowich, that dynamic duo, coming to help us with our horror stories. And the week after that, we have Writing Romantasy just in time for Valentine's Day. So folks, make sure you tune in. It will be an absolute pleasure to see you all. We are now going on a raid, and our raid shout is Light Up the Forge. So shout it out when you get to Dazzling Cat's channel. I would imagine that they are tackling the New Year's Resolutions Challenge, and you guys should be too. You can find that live over on the website right now, worldanvil.com, where we challenge you to read work from the incredible community and use it to inspire you for New Year's resolutions. Then take the first step. I cannot wait to see what you're going to be spending your 2026 doing. So yeah, make sure you get your entry in soon for a shiny badge. that's all from us today. So I'd like to wish you all the most beautiful of weekends. Biggest love, and we will talk to you soon. Grab your hammer and go well build.